Well, thank you very much, Professor, for joining us. Let me just jump right into it. Um, in your book, you seem to argue that racism itself was a Western invention. I think if you say that to most Westerners, they would think it's ridiculous. Now, can you explain why some scholars think that that is the case?
Right. So, what different cultures have different ways of thinking about difference, and then racialized difference is only one of the ways that people can interpret difference, and it's only one of the ways that people account for human difference. You say that Westerners might, the automatic reaction might be to say that, well, it's ridiculous to say that we're not all racist. I think that in the West, people might have this opinion that we're all universally racist, that we're born racist, that it's ridiculous to claim that this wasn't always the case. But I think that very attitude is actually symptomatic of a product of deliberate miseducation and the product of a very manufactured narrative under which we actually all live with today. But first of all, let's talk about this racial way of accounting for human difference, and to get clear on what that actually really means. First of all, we have to be clear that race is not a biological reality, it's not empirical reality, but instead it's a social construct. This means that by that very fact, it means that race was an invention. It was invented by human beings. It's an idea that was invented. But although this idea of race is unempirical, it happened to have a tremendous hold on Western culture up until very recently, actually. Prior to World War II, the idea that race is biological reality was accepted as common sense and scientific by Western societies. However, there was a shift actually very recently, well, in historical terms. In the post-World War II period, there was a kind of paradigm shift, and many scientists, anthropologists, biologists, geneticists contributed to the huge amount of evidence establishing that biological race in humans is non-existent. It was established that the idea of race was a pseudoscientific, unscientific idea. And then much of this consensus, this new consensus that race is not biologically real, follows this particular idea that there is more genetic variation within so-called races than there was between races. So there is literally no biological basis for their idea of race. And then so today we live with that consensus, and according to the anthropologist Robert Wood Sussman, the vast majority of those involved in research today on human variation would agree that biological races do not exist among humans. And this scientific fact is as valid and true as the fact that the Earth is round and revolves around the sun. So we live within that paradigm today. And it's just taken to be, that's the scientific consensus today. So although this idea of race has no biological basis, that doesn't mean it doesn't have a social meaning. These sort of things don't kind of map onto each other. It still has a lot of social meaning. It structures our institutions. It structures the way that humans think about difference. And so that's what I mean, or what we mean when we say that race is a social construct. It has a social reality to it. But if it is indeed the case that race is a social construct, then it's clearly possible that different societies or cultures construct races in different ways, or that they don't even group human beings in racialized ways at all, or theorize physical and cultural differences in sort of these racialized ways. And so this is where this kind of Confucian rectification of names becomes important. What do we mean specifically when we say that difference is racialized, or we talk about racism or races? I observe this tendency to think that the mere act of perceiving difference is racism. But I tend to disagree. I don't think that you can say that merely perceiving difference is racism. Instead, I would argue that it's this kind of particular way that perceived difference is interpreted that makes the attitude racist. And so it's this particular way that Western cultures interpret perceived difference that then becomes racist. And then, so racial ideology has a very specific way of interpreting difference. And this way of interpreting difference that encourages specific behaviors that then you would call racist. So, intergroup conflict happens all throughout histories, and all peoples see difference. And then, people fight for different reasons. There's different reasons for you to fight with another group for resources, for example. But then, could you possibly say that that fighting for resources between different groups is racism? So we have to become clear about what exactly is kind of racially motivated behavior. And what is particularly problematic about the racialized worldview is not the fact of being able to see difference, but instead it's putting perceived difference onto a hierarchy of value. For example, when the German philosopher Immanuel Kant talks about how Americans, by which he means Native Americans and Blacks, cannot govern themselves, they thus serve only for slaves. Here, okay, there's a kind of differences, that obviously there's difference between Native Americans, Blacks, and so forth, but then there's a hierarchy here. And then there's posited that their difference makes them such that they are so irrational, that they're incapable of governing themselves, and then so they have to be enslaved. That kind of attitude is morally problematic. Or when he says that the whites possess all motivating forces and talents in itself. Here this idea that civilization only comes from one group of people, and the other groups of people cannot possibly be capable of autonomously coming to civilization on their own. Or when he says that the white race possesses all motivating forces and talents, or when he says that all races will be extinguished, only not that of the whites. So here again, this idea that only the white race will have it in themselves to sort of get to the finishing line, and then everybody else will be sort of so inferior in some ways that they'll just drop. They won't quite make it to the end. This kind of attitude that civilization is only available to a single group of people, and then the other races must serve them as slaves is morally problematic. And it's because these kind of views legitimize or motivate certain kinds of behaviors, very destructive behaviors. For example, the genocide on the American continent of the natives, or the genocide of the Jewish people during the Second World War for no other reason than their race. These kind of attitudes are what I describe as racist. And then I also argue that these kind of attitudes are not universal. Instead, they're actually culturally specific and are rooted in certain philosophical assumptions. So you were saying that that many today would say that these views that my claim that racism isn't universal is ridiculous, absurd. But I think that there's also a history for why people might think that, because there was this concerted attempt on the part of Western governments to whitewash its own history. Up until the 19th century, no European questioned the fact of racial hierarchies, and until very recently, race was a positive ideal in the self-image of the West. They would have referred to themselves back in the day as Anglo-Saxons, Aryans, and Teutons, and this was like a positive self-identity, kind of a white supremacist self-identity that was meant to inspire confidence and was portrayed as this kind of unique and superior Western civilization. But then obviously it's taboo to espouse those kind of attitudes today. But then there's reasons for why that happened. There's specific historical reasons. For example, firstly, there was a fear of racial revenge by the Western powers, the Western colonial powers, fear of racial revenge from the people that they colonized. Secondly, there's the comparatively more egalitarian racially egalitarian example that the Soviet Union had, and that provided a challenge to the Western colonial powers. And thirdly, the Nazi regime and the great association with kind of these racial policies really discredited that racial ideology. So there are reasons why today we don't really remember the history of how formative racial ideology was. And also in the East Asian context, East Asians are perhaps also sometimes particularly ignorant of this history, because they actually have a kind of model minority status, both in the international context and within the domestic context of Western societies, notably the USA.
If pre-modern China, according to you, had no conception of race, so it was never racist, because racism was a Western invention. So how should we understand China? Because I think a lot of people assume, Han supremacy or Chinese, the central Zhongguo, the central nations is a highly ethnocentric conception. So
yeah.
So maybe that's somewhat different from Western racism, but still still a version of racism. I don't know if that's a fair way of putting it.
Yeah. Okay.
Because what you're arguing is that the Chinese were never racist. It seems to me.
Yeah. Yeah.
All the people would think that's not the case. Would not think that's true.
Yeah. So I think that like I said, across history, people have intergroup conflicts, and then I don't think it's at all the case that the Chinese didn't think that they were somehow superior to other people. But there's different ways you can think of yourself as superior. So whatever the people in this geographic region, the Sinosphere, whoever ruled this region at the time, they obviously saw a distinction between themselves and others, and then they did think of themselves as superior to others. But then this way of thinking of yourself as superior, there is very important differences between this way of thinking of yourself than with what I have called the racial attitude. Because it was far less destructive. And this is the thing that I'm trying to get at. There is something so uniquely destructive about whatever you want to call it. I've called it racism. You can call it by something else, but I call it racism because it's a word that's pervasively used. And if I invent a new word, then it's if you have to kind of wrap their brains around the new concept. So what I'm trying to understand is the uniquely destructive nature of this period of European history. How, why a whole continent of people being kind of, obviously disease helped, but then, like I've said in the book, the intent was always deliberately genocidal, according to the historical evidence. This idea that you want to get rid of an entire continent of people, you can't say that that's somehow universal across all human history, that all human beings universally want to do this to other people. And okay, the Chinese obviously thought of themselves as superior, but then that kind of sense of superiority didn't then end in the same pattern of behaviors. And I'm saying there's reasons why this was the case. First of all, the sense of superiority was cultural. It wasn't biological, which gets to the heart of why this racialized understanding of difference is so destructive and potent, because under that racialized view of sense of superiority, the person that you deemed as inferior cannot possibly change. You can't possibly become a civilized, right? But whereas if the Chinese view, as I've stressed in the book, they have the understanding of what human is actually a process of growth. And very importantly, the kind of the education that you receive, the acculturation that you receive, then you have a very different understanding of what being human is. Where if being human is this kind of biological essence, which you either have or you don't have, then you can't. Then the people that you deem to be somehow subhuman, they can't possibly become civilized. And so that's one way of, okay, it's true the Chinese thought of themselves as superior, but then if the understanding of superiority is cultural, then that makes a big difference. And then secondly, you can understand superiority different ways. There's many ways you can demonstrate that you're powerful. Like I've described in the book, there's ways of thinking. The Chinese way of thinking about power contributes to the particular way in which they weren't that destructive. Power wasn't necessarily seen in terms of domination. In the book, I describe the overwhelming image of the Western understanding. Well, what we say Western, and what we were generally meaning is this kind of Greco-Roman Christian from the Greek classical period to the medieval and then into contemporary times. This overwhelming image is one of how to demonstrate your power is that of domination, being able to subjugate other people. But then that's not the only way you can demonstrate your power. In the Chinese context, the much more overwhelming image of what is seen as power, de, the Chinese word is de, which also means virtue, and which also means efficacy, is the image of wu wei, this non-coercive action, this not acting by not acting. And then the great image of this is Confucius when he says that if you're a person of de, if you rule by virtue, then the myriad lesser stars just kind of circle you. You don't have to do anything. And that is the overwhelming image of what superiority is. And then if you have that image of superiority, you're necessarily not going to go, coercively dominate other people. So
I have some issues with that line of thinking, especially when you emphasize the destructiveness of Western racism. Obviously, you know Chinese dynastic history far better than me, but it strikes me that in many dynasties, there were auto-genocide as well as external genocide, genocide against its own people, something like the Khmer Rouge, and external genocides, and also other races killing other groups killing other groups, while the imperial court sanctions encourage one other and the other. The Uyghur, for example, I think wiped out an earlier group in Xinjiang that during the last dynasty, and the imperial court encouraged the Uyghur to do it and let them settle in what is now Xinjiang. If I got my history right. So even though it wasn't directly, so the Manchu dynasty or Qin dynasty wasn't directly involved in the killing, they certainly encouraged it and let the settler Uyghurs go away with it, which paradoxically they now are being accused of trying to wipe out culturally the Uyghur. I think there were other incidences where the Harvard psychologist Pinker, right? He had a list of the world's most destructive killings. I think the top one was in China, right? I can't remember what they were. I think it was in the maybe the Tong, where is it? I can't remember it. But anyway, it strikes me that you can find many examples of both auto-genocides and external genocides. It's not all peaceful. So
so in the book, I say that this is not the case, that China was somehow peaceful. This is why I stress that people fight among themselves all the time. People there also are very other destructive reasons why people fight among themselves, but we have to be clear when it is racially motivated and when it's not. So the case you talk about the Manchu, well, first of all, the Manchus are not Chinese in the sense that perhaps they weren't culturally very Chinese, where when they you can debate to what extent they were culturally Chinese because they were a conquering dynasty, So when I say Chinese, I mean people who really have this very kind of Confucian Confucian and this kind of classical outlook formed by this kind of classical textual
It's all
education.
become Chinese because Chinese is not a race. Chinese is a discipline, is a cultural discipline. So
Yeah,
you, in fact, according to Confucius, anyone can be Chinese. I
yeah,
think if I understand correct, it's a matter of discipline, training to be a gentleman. That becomes
yeah.
Chinese. You follow the ritual, you become Chinese. So yeah, originally the conquerors might have been an external tribes, but they could become Chinese. And the Manchu, in fact, adopted the law of Chinese. Well, basically, they took in the entire Chinese governing system, but even though with them on the top, but it was still a Chinese system, wasn't it?
Yeah, but
Until
I'm
they
saying
became
that
Chinese.
yes, but I'm saying like because I'm not sure when this happened. I'm saying that when they first came into China, maybe their mentality was still,
Right.
you know, it wasn't completely like was cynicized. Yeah. Anyway, but that's also kind of tangential. The point is that people fight for a lot of people fight for different reasons, and then they can be incredibly bloody. So it's not this is why I stress it's not like different people, intergroup conflict is normal throughout history, and it can also be very bloody. Warring States China is very, very bloody, but would you say, but then the reason, the causes for conflict, you have to be very specific. Were they racially motivated? And by racially motivated, I mean you have this the more kind of classical view. One of the classical views is the Jews in the Second World War. They managed to assimilate throughout hundreds of years. They assimilated into European society, but then still there was this need to like get rid of this group of people. That's racially motivated. Was there even necessarily a pragmatic reason why they had to go? I would argue there was no pragmatic reason. And then that's why, as I say, it's racial. There's a particular ideology which is unempirical. Whereas the conflicts throughout Chinese history, even among the Manchus, I would say there was much more pragmatic reason for why they were needing to do it. People they wanted the land, they wanted the resources. But then there was something very specific about racially motivated behaviors. So, for example, in the United States, okay, so the settlers came and tried to, well, they kind of killed off a lot of the natives. But then, if you look at something like the Cherokee tribe, for example, towards the end, they were trying very, very hard to assimilate into European culture. They took on their Western dress, Western culture, but then they were still try to be got rid of, And I think that it comes to a point in which there's no other explanation for why you needed to do this than something that you call race. There is the particular ideology that is not based in pragmatic considerations. And of course, all these other, which isn't to say that kind of racial conflict is the only kind of conflict among different groups of people.
Right. Okay. Let's change the topic a little bit. There are some words that I think we know what we mean, but according to you, we don't actually know what we mean, or we're so misguided about what we mean. I think among this is such fundamental words as being Chinese or China or Han Chinese or Han supremacy. I mean, what Han even means. And you seem to think these words actually have very different meaning in the perhaps pre-modern period and then in the modern period. So do you think if foreigners have other people have better understanding of these words, perhaps a Western educated person like myself have better understanding of these words, that we might be able to rectify the names, as Confucius says, and maybe bridge a lot of misunderstanding about China and what it's trying to do in the contemporary.
So I think that a lot of the concepts we use to understand China today, a lot of Western concepts which don't really map onto the traditional Chinese way of understanding itself, and then the traditional Chinese way of understanding its own difference to other people. So this term that's very popular now, sort of Han supremacism. So I think it suggests this idea that the Han are a particular race of people, in the sense that they are people of common descent. They were related by blood through common descent. But I think this is not a completely accurate way to understand the Chinese identity. So racial identity puts the emphasis on some kind of essence or biological descent, but then the traditional Chinese way of understanding what is Chinese is actually practice, the kind of practice that you exhibit, or the behavior that you manifest, or your ability to take on a particular culture. So, if you're able to speak Chinese, that's a very important thing. You're able to speak Chinese, you perform according to the norms, so be filial, and then these kind of things make you Chinese. So I think your question can be addressed by just looking at the etymology of the term China, because whilst China is a term that is used in many languages, actually doesn't have exact correspondence in Chinese language itself, in Chinese tradition. So the term China is a transliteration of the term Qin, so the first dynasty of China. So what we're referring to is a particular dynasty. We're not referring to a group of people of common descent. And then Han, the Han Chinese, also a dynasty. So the appellation of Chinese is of Han is actually referring to a dynasty. And then the Chinese diaspora are familiar with Chinatown, or Tang Renjie, but Tang is referring to the Tang dynasty. So they're the people of the Tang. And then Zhongguo that you mentioned earlier, in the pre-Qin period, it would have just meant the central states. It was like a geographic region. So the Chinese just didn't ever talk about themselves in this biological way. So today we have the Han Chinese, but that is also a product of the ethnic classification of this that the Communist Party of China used when they founded the People's Republic, and then they borrowed actually from the Soviet model, and then that's how they created the 55 ethnic minorities and then the Han people. But then the Han people, the way that Han people was created was just people so they went around and asked what kind of group do you think you belong to, and those who didn't think that they belonged to any group were just lumped into the Han classification. So the Han is, even according to this kind of ethnic system of classification, is just a miscellaneous group of people who didn't sort of think that they identify with anything specifically. And I just want to contrast that to the idea of race and nation, because as I've argued, not in the book but elsewhere, I think this idea of nation is actually doesn't come from just the Treaty of Westphalia in the 17th century. It's actually rooted in much more ancient Greek ideas about autochthony. So, which means that the Athenians thought that they were Athenian because of common descent, and their ancestors were literally born from the earth itself. And so Athenians were people who were born from the earth and then never left anywhere else. And then if you mix with foreigners, that degrades you. You become not completely Athenian anymore. And then foreigners cannot just move to Athens and then become Athenian, because it's a matter of biological descent, right? And if Athenians move elsewhere, then they become degraded as well. So this kind of idea is more familiar to us in terms of the blood and soil, the Blut and Boden kind of idea of 19th, 20th century nationalism. And I think that the Chinese identity contrasts very strongly to that way of thinking about identity, which is actually a very common and pervasive way of thinking about identity.
Okay. Where I want to pick up with you is because of the Chinese, the modern Chinese state classification of different races. And the modern state, the modern Chinese state, whether it was after 1912 or 1949, was for intents and purposes really a modern state, and that inevitably strikes me must have taken on some features of Western racism. So it became kind of there. I think there is undeniably an element of racism in contemporary China, but it's not just individual racism, but I think in terms of state policy, simply on the basis of the features of modern state, and also how it classified the 54, is it 54 races or groups, racial groups in China. I think that at least runs in the danger of modern racism, doesn't it?
Yeah. So this idea of modern, so I think you're suggesting that there is something very
I think modern state inevitably associated with nationalism, and nationalism, I think, went throughout 20th century Chinese history. And nationalism, I think, inevitably, Chinese nationalism inevitably got tied up in being Chinese. And so now you have a kind of ethnic self-perception that's quite different from the Confucian definition of one: become a gentleman, becoming civilized, becoming a humane person. That's becoming Chinese. That's very different. The kind of nationalism was very Western, very modern, and by your definition, probably racist.
Yeah. Yes, I think that the globalization of certain ideas, kind of more directly through the colonial era, but then continuing into today, kind of more indirectly. Not just, I mean, you mentioned the kind of institutionalized features. Yeah, sure. And then also, when we talk about modern China, we're talking about something very different to the pre-modern tradition, which is why my book only focuses on.
Yeah, I realize that it's not fair to judge your book on modern China because you only talk about pre-modern dynastic China, right?
Yeah.
I want to make that clear. Yeah.
Yeah, no, but I'm saying, yeah, I agree, because it's not just in the institutionalized features. You can see it there, arguably, but then also arguably just in the kind of globalization of cultures. Like you can see very clearly in the records in the Republican era, Chinese intellectuals trying to think about Chinese identity in racialized terms because of just the pervasiveness of social Darwinism. They had to like think about themselves suddenly in these kind of like racial terms. And then they had to like try to understand their relationship to the world in these kind of racial terms, because that was just a dominant framework. And like I said earlier, it was taken to be scientific. You had China was like kind of like beaten down, and then they were like trying to think about why they were so beaten down through kind of these racial terms. And then they in some ways so these kind of ideas were globalized, and then they took it very seriously for a time too, because it was presented as scientific to them, and then just culturally, I mean, not just in the institutionalized way, culturally, the culture is in some ways there's very different, in some ways is very different to the kind of pre-modern times. I would stress that something like anti-Black racism is, pervasive. It's unfortunately it's pervasive, but then also kind of white supremacism, because China, in some ways, you can talk about modernity, that China is modernized and taking on these kind of institutions, but then another way of saying it is that it's colonized. It takes on the mentality is in some ways has taken on a kind of colonized racial hierarchy. The Chinese don't even think of themselves as kind of like it's not Han supremacism. It's much more white supremacism. There's a kind of internalized inferiority that whenever you think about the white man in particular, that's the standard of what humanity is. And then anything else is kind of a deviation from that. So literally that kind of racial hierarchy that I described, Kant was saying, was universalized, and then to some extent, I have to say only to some extent, it's also internalized by the kind of the aspects of Chinese culture too. So the modern contemporary times is obviously different to the kind of the history and the philosophy that I talk about in the book.
Well, one last question, since we're running out of time. Your book is called Chinese Cosmopolitanism, and that's not a modern phenomenon. For you, it's an ancient phenomenon. But it also sounds a bit like, I think, at least compatible with what in Western society we call multiculturalism, whether it is an assimilation model or a kind of live and let live difference, that unity and differences kind of multiculturalism. But in any way, it seems to me what the ancient Chinese cosmopolitanism is compatible with Western multiculturalism, and I think in the end they will pretty much have to translate into the same thing in practice. And what do you think about that?
So I think there are actually important differences between the kind of Chinese cosmopolitanism that I've described or tried to reconstruct than the kind of dominant liberal multiculturalism and in the United States, for example, because very importantly, central to this liberal multiculturalism is that it prescribes that we leave each other's cultures alone. But for the Chinese cosmopolitanism that I described, this leaving each other alone would actually signal the failure of cosmopolitanism. Because the image that I use to describe Chinese cosmopolitanism is the image of Confucius in the company of two others. And he says that when I'm among the company of two others, I'm always able to learn something. From the person who exhibits good behaviors, I copy their good behaviors. And the person who exhibits bad behaviors, I make sure that I self-reflect. I make sure that I'm not exhibiting those same behaviors in my own person. So the presence of difference and others, and you can think of different cultures, is always an opportunity for me to learn. And so under Chinese cosmopolitanism, we really have to actively engage with the other people's worldviews, others' cultures, and therefore be ready to challenge some of our own received ideas. And it is through this kind of process of interacting with others and challenging my own received ideas that I can possibly grow. But then this kind of growth also means change. I'm making sure that I'm not staying the same. And so my dominant thought is that its cultures have to interact and grow through interaction and dialogue. And then I think that under this kind of Chinese cosmopolitanism that I described, this leaving each other alone is actually kind of like a last resort. Only when you feel like you can't possibly reason with them because they've proven themselves so unreasonable that you sort of leave them alone. And so that's kind of this kind of passive toleration is actually the kind of the pits, the bottom, the last resort. Whereas the Chinese cosmopolitanism is actually a much more kind of active desire to engage. And then I think there's another aspect that it's Chinese cosmopolitanism would be different to that kind of liberal multiculturalism, because that kind of liberal multiculturalist attitude tends to see our cultural identities as kind of merely private affiliations that is not meant to allow us to sort of enter into the public domain. But under the view that I described, the way to achieve common public ends that can be shared by different peoples isn't to remove all differences, because that's perhaps kind of not possible. But instead, to achieve those kind of common ends, we integrate different perspectives. So the structure that I envision is that everybody is in this kind of company of others, and then everybody want to integrate the good behaviors that they see in others, and then make sure that within themselves they correct the bad behaviors that they perceive. And so if all cultures behaved in this way, we can envision a future state in which all cultures come to a kind of accommodation with each other, and then ultimately an integration of all cultures. And so very key and pivotal to this kind of Chinese cosmopolitanism is the maintenance of free flow this unimpeded free flow, or in Chinese terms, tong, this the Chinese word that is very important for Chinese medicine and for philosophy, this unimpeded free flow. So, you know, in your body, you have different organs, and then there has to be free flow between them for there to be health. And in the same way, for there to be health among the kind of like the world, between different peoples, we have to maintain this kind of free flow. And so under that kind of view of interaction and free flow, that kind of liberal multicultural way to deal with difference is actually a failure, because what you end up getting is just cultural ghettos that don't interact with each other. So I think there are important differences of that kind of Chinese cosmopolitanism I described than the liberal multiculturalist view.